Welcome to another episode of Streaming with a Purpose. It's time to be inspired and motivated to live your best life on purpose. On Streaming with a Purpose, hear the stories of people who have, despite the odds, dealt with the challenges that life sometimes brings, but who still manage to overcome those odds. If you think life is tough and you have to settle for where you are, my guests and I are here to tell you you don't have to. I speak to people who were once where you are and are now living their purpose, and I want to encourage you to live your life to the fullest. I am your host, Sylvia Montgomery. Let's take a listen to our next guest. Welcome to another episode of Streaming with a Purpose. I'm your host, Sylvia Montgomery, and I'm so glad that you could join us here today. So today's show is very crucial to events and things that are going on in our country. And as we talk about purpose today, my guest is a person who has spent so much of her time advocating for the rights and protections of people of color. In light of our current climate, it seemed only appropriate, and with it being Black History Month, to invite my guest today, Linda Thomas, to the show to have a conversation about some of the things that are currently going on in our country. Hi, Linda. How are you today?
I am fine, Miss Sylvia. It is wonderful to be here with you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You are so welcome. I'm so glad that you had the time to even accept my invitation. So I feel so honored to have you here today. And the reason I feel so honored, I'm going to share a little bit of Linda's bio with you. Linda Thomas is a community volunteer, activist, and civil rights advocate. She is the first African American to serve as president of the library board in her community, and she was elected to 5 consecutive terms. Under her leadership was the development of a $1.5 million building plan for a new library. As an advocate for students in the public school system, Linda developed and implemented an African American studies course in her local high school. She's been active in her local NAACP for more than 30 years and has served as Education Committee Chairperson, Vice President, and President. Linda served on the State Conference Executive Committee twice and is the only person who was twice elected as the state president of the Virginia NAACP by unanimous vote. She served 3 terms as the president, and in 2013, Linda was elected to serve as secretary of the Virginia State Conference NAACP, and in 2014, not 1914, but in 2014, she was hired to serve as the state NAACP Director of Administration. Linda continues to serve the executive committee as the chair of the state police chiefs and sheriffs from across the Commonwealth. Linda is an author, a dynamic speaker, and most importantly, a resident of my hometown in the great state of Virginia. So it is an honor to have you here today, Linda, with your wealth of experience and expertise. It seems only appropriate to talk with you about the current events of today. So we're just going to hop right on in. So Linda, the U.S. 47th President, Donald J. Trump, he ran his campaign this past year for the past presidential election on what he stood for. He was very vocal, open, and honest about his intentions and his plans for the country. In 2020, as his first term as the 45th president was winding down, there was a surge of racial divide across the country. 2/3 of respondents surveyed at that time felt there was an increase in racial tension. And as a result, many workplaces expanded their DEI efforts. Despite the racial tension, the January 6th riot on the nation's capital, and in my opinion, the fact that his thinking on the 2024 campaign trail seemed to align with that of a dictator, here we are. Donald Trump is once again our president. And what's most concerning to me about that, Linda, and as I'm sure is the case with many people of color, is that the majority of Americans seem to be okay with his agenda. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that agenda. We're talking the elimination of DEI in Black History Month, birthright citizenship, the elimination of books that tell the story of slavery in America, and renaming landmarks to appropriately honor US history, because all of this affects people of color, which is certainly elevating racial tensions again. So, Linda, I'll just start off because I'm Swimming with a Purpose. We do focus on purpose and, what and how that just fuels people moving forward. You spent a huge amount of your time advocating. Would you say that this is your purpose?
Absolutely. Uh, my parents instilled in me the idea that you had to be the change you wanted to see. You couldn't say you wanted different. You couldn't ask for different if you weren't willing to be part of making that difference, making that change. I saw my parents do that. They were community volunteers. I remember volunteering my dad when I was in the third grade. An announcement was made in the classroom that there was a PTA meeting and they would be looking for a PTA president. I had a basic understanding of what the Parent Teachers Association was. President sounded good, and I figured my dad was the most important person I knew, so he should be the president. And I told my teacher, my dad will do that. He's not doing anything else. I don't think my dad really appreciated me framing it that way, but he went on to serve for PTA president at my elementary school through my entire time at the elementary school and beyond because my younger brother was 4 years younger than me. So that type of commitment was what I saw in my home. My mother volunteered in child care, in elder care. She got her nurse's license and sat on the board of directors for the community health center. So volunteerism and taking the initiative to do something to make community better or life better or citizenship better was just something that was instilled in me from a very early age. And I just posted, believe yesterday, a picture of me at 4 or 5 years old because I was in kindergarten and I was given the leadership award. I had little understanding of what leadership was, but I knew an award was good. But it was comical to my parents and especially my older sister that in kindergarten, who are you leading in kindergarten? I don't know, but they gave me the award. But that type of nurturing, encouragement coming from as early as I can remember, I am clear that my purpose is to use this warrior spirit for good.
Mhm. It sounds to me, Linda, like that was in you all along. That leadership award was very well due. Even your teachers saw that early on in your life. And because of the encouragement and the nurturing that you received along the way, it just fueled you even more and gave you the boost that you needed in order to be able to do what you do for so many people today. And I just want to thank you for leaning into your purpose so hard.
Well, I don't know anything else to do. The joke used to always be learn to use your powers for good.
Mhm.
So this is the mission to take whatever it is that I am, whatever I can bring to the table, and use it for good, positive change.
Mhm. Okay, awesome. So we're just going to go ahead and delve a little bit into some of the events and things that are happening today. Just want to start off that no sooner than Trump was in office on January 20th, he signed a massive number of executive orders, more than any other sitting president on their first day in office or their first week. And some of these executive orders are detrimental to marginal communities. The elimination of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, that we've been hearing so much about lately. And DEI existed to ensure that every worker, regardless of their skin color, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender or religion, could be treated fairly and with dignity and respect and have the same opportunities, especially as everyone else. But that all seems to have gone out the window now, especially with the dismantling of the federal workplace, losing their jobs without dignity, lack of respect, and for no good reason. As someone who's dedicated so much of her time advocating on behalf of people of color, how far back is this taking us?
Only as far back as we allow.
Mm.
Intellectually, nothing changed from the moment the 47th president was inaugurated until now. It I love that you started by saying diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think it's very important that moving forward, we use those three words, not DEI, because it's too easy to get lost in that or to presume that it means something that it does not. When you actually say the words, then we are compelled to address what is it that we are saying we are against. Is it the diversity? Do we think that it is not good to have the workforce in any sense fairly represented by all of the community spectrum, whatever that would mean? Do we Are we saying that we believe equity is wrong, that folks should be dealt with fairly, with justice, with that purpose being right there out front, that we want a workplace that is considered fair, non-hostile? Or is it the inclusion part that we want the right to not be welcoming to folks that may not look like us, worship like us, may not have the full use of their body, may not verbalize the way we do, may have an accent? What is it that we are actually saying? And what part of that do we not want? Because as we continue to pronounce ourselves to be a Christian nation largely, that we follow the Judaic Christian principles, then what part of diversity, equity, and inclusion is antithetical to the teachings of Christ, which we want to promote as the baseline of following? Or to put it more simply, and again, the lessons of my parents. What is it that you want that you don't want somebody else to have? What is it that you are willing to do to someone else that you don't want done to you? It is at its essence that simple. And that is why I am a community advocate, at times an activist, because they go hand in hand. If I say I'm about something and I'm going to speak forward into it and speak truth to power, as I have been taught and trained to do, then at times that requires that I put that into action. It can't just be a thought, it can't just be words. I actually have to put that into an action. So, yeah, essentially, the DEI to me seems more of a smokescreen to scapegoat a group of people, or peoples in this case, and make them the problem instead of addressing the real um, brokenness of our collective moral compass.
Wow. Just a couple of things I just wanted to piggyback on. When you first started out and you said it will go as far as we allow it to go. And immediately what came to my mind is, I don't really see a lot of the national type people out in front leading the way as the Martin Luther King Juniors. And And the list can go on and on and on. But when we're not seeing that type of visibility on a national level, and immediately being a person of purpose, I'm thinking, wow, if more of us who were meant to do this type of work, as you are, would lean into that as well, it would be great to see that on a national level. And then the other thing I just wanted to piggyback on is when you broke down the diversity, equity, and inclusion, yeah, immediately what came to my mind was social justice. And as you talked about the Christian values, this is what Jesus Christ he taught on. This is what he walked and taught his whole time here on earth. It was all about social justice. So, and in essence, just listening to you, if we take that diversity, equity, and inclusion away, yeah, it is eliminating that whole segment, that whole part that Jesus worked so hard to try to instill in us. And for those of us who do have that instilled up in us and understand the importance of social justice, it should be important for us to not allow it to take us back. But Linda, there are other businesses that are already doing the same. They're following suit and pulling out a DEI. And without that DEI, there are no protections in place for employees. There's no basis for possibly identifying claims of illegal workplace discrimination. Some might even say that it's legalizing discrimination in the workplace. Would you agree?
Yeah, this is not the first time that we've experienced this in America. The reason that the NAACP, as an example, was formed in 1909 was response to what had basically been legalized and codified by America. The lynching of Black people, to eliminate them, the segregationist laws of the post-Reconstruction era that we call Jim Crow, all of that was deemed acceptable and allowable until there were people like myself willing to advocate for change that led to fairness, that led to the constitutional protections actually being for all American people, regardless of race, creed, color, religion, or sexual orientation. What we are witnessing is a small segment, a small vocal segment of Americans saying, we don't want this. Now, to fill in the blank, I can't fill in the blank. I can't make the leap of logic or intellect that in any way makes that right or fair. I know my moral compass may need some fine tuning from time to time, but it doesn't need any great adjustment to help me to understand the basic principles of right and wrong and fair or unjust. So, what we have watched is the ushering in again of these ideas that are antithetical to anything that we would consider American. Our Constitution was written by folks who didn't always have their moral compass set properly. But the general idea, these founding principles, are, I believe, right for the most part. Our failure as humans to live up to the idea of I should not do to you that which I do not want done to me should be the guiding beacon that brings us back into alignment with this principled approach of America. When we fail to do that and we allow, in any sense, ourselves to be guided and governed by fear and fear mongering that leads to hate and hate mongering, we weaken America. We weaken the pillars of justice. We weaken the principled idea of a democratic republic. That is not good for any of us who call ourselves citizens of this republic. It should be repugnant to us on the surface, and we don't have to dig too far into it to understand what our work must be if we are to strengthen and promote the strength of this principled thing we used to call American democracy that made us so exceptional. And I certainly cannot fall outside of the embrace of that we, the people, having been born here, bred here, fed that dream, believe it, and still believe it, and still fight for that. But it shouldn't have to be my fight, it should be my right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you started off saying that a small number, a small amount of voices, something to that effect. And again, what that says to me is not enough voices, not enough of us stepping into our purpose, not enough of us understanding and realizing, as you had said on the end there, about how our democracy as Americans is slowly slipping away from us. And it's just so important that we're concerned enough to not want that to happen. Um, Wow. After the events of 2020, and I just go back to that because, there was, everything seemed a little, well, it's been happening. It was happening before 2020, but it seemed like during that particular time, everything just sort of went to a whole new level. So after those events in 2020, with the killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and the list could go on because there were, many before and many after as well. But there seemed to be an awakening of how this country operated for hundreds of years. Like I said, I think we had been asleep for a while, under the impression that everything was good. But there was an awakening that, oh yeah, this happened and that actually happened. We're not over that. It still exists among us. When we talk about slavery and how African Americans were severely treated, as well as other people of color, so many things came to light. So many issues with people calling the police on Black people just for walking the streets. As a result, some careful thought was given to renaming particular streets and monuments from names that didn't represent the unity that we'd like to see in this country. Trump is now making a play to rename landmarks to appropriately honor U.S. history, to honor the contributions of visionary and patriotic Americans in our nation's rich past. And at least that's what they're saying. But what could this mean for all of the progress made in the past few years? And I know even here locally, we had some monuments taken away and some streets renamed here in this area. Could all of that end up being reversed?
Of course, it all of the progress of the past is in danger, but all of the progress of the past was never really secure. When you think in terms of the Voting Rights Act that had to be reevaluated and was ultimately gutted and dismantled because it was an act, not settled law. It felt like it, but it was not settled law. So it was easy to dismantle it and therefore reverse the order of things. These things are extremely concerning, extremely disconcerting. But I think Benjamin Franklin said it best when he said, you have a republic if you can keep it. It requires the vigilance of the citizens. It requires the engagement of the citizens. And I think what was allowed by the citizens was this feeling of it's all okay. There's someone who's going to take care of us. We are now clear that our engagement is essential. Our representative voice is given to others in Congress through the congressional process, through the election of senators. But that does not mean that the citizens do not have to remain vigilant and keep safeguards in place as preventative measures for what we see happening now. But the ebb and flow of it has been fairly consistent throughout history. Ground is gained, uh, some equality is won, some freedoms are hard fought for and therefore become the law of the land until it isn't. So post-Civil War, there was the emancipation of enslaved African Americans until President Johnson took over after the assassination of Lincoln, and the order began to be reversed. And slowly things were put in place to essentially keep African Americans in some form of enslavement by making laws that said unequal treatment is not only right, but it's necessary, separate but equal. And as we see how we ebb and flow in the course of history, how there are gains made that often end in violence, chaos, anarchy, lawlessness, it seems we have entered into a new period where people of color must be extra vigilant and white people of goodwill have to be more outspoken. Because I do believe that this is not the majority of the country. This was the majority of the folks who bothered to vote. And we have to look at that very, very seriously and try to understand why so many folks have been disengaged, why so many folks feel a sense of hopelessness, why so many folks felt that it was better for them to remain silent than to challenge the growing cacophony of bitter voices and fearful ideas and hateful rhetoric instead of rising to their better angels and their higher ideals of what America should be and what she should look like. And so it's a challenge. It has always been, but democracy is in and of itself a challenge. How do you harness this collective energy and distill it into a governing voice and a body that is by design to promote fairness for its citizens, protections for its citizens? And how can it ever be thought that it could be right and good and work well if you begin the process by saying who doesn't deserve citizenship and who doesn't deserve fairness and who doesn't deserve justice? It always comes back to that essential argument of what is it that you want that you don't want your fellow citizen to have? These are complicated and complex questions, and we've spent the last 400 years actually trying very hard to avoid that conversation. And I say it is a conversation that we must have. We must have. And as Christians, and I am definitively, proudly, unapologetically a Christian, therefore I know everything I ever read in that red letter edition of the Bible screams to me that we must not continue to avoid this conversation. We must not dismiss our humanity. We must see Jesus in each other, lest we perish as fools.
Mhm. And it was something you said a little earlier. It made me feel better but then it didn't. It was the fact that you said that the majority, you don't feel that the majority of the country feels this way and is really online, in line with this agenda. It was the majority who voted. So it feels good to know that maybe, possibly, the majority of the country does not feel this way. Maybe this is not who America really is. But then it's sort of disconcerting the fact that enough of us don't feel um, or don't appreciate democracy enough to actually want to have a voice. And as you talked about the last 400 years, what we've had to fight for, what our ancestors have had to fight for. I have not had to do much fighting myself because of them, but what they have fought for all of these hundreds of years, bringing it to light to provide this and allowing us the opportunity to even have a seat at the table now is not as important to so many of us. That really concerns me. And it is very important that we understand that our voices make a difference. One voice can make a difference. But when you take that one voice and multiply that one voice thousands and thousands and thousands of times, when you look at the number of people that may not have voted, so their voice was not heard, that's important. And that could be a very huge number. And it's important that we understand that we need to speak up, that we need to have a voice. And the best way was in that voting opportunity where so few of us stepped up. And so many of us did not step up to that occasion. But I do find it difficult to honor certain individuals that once received such high regard in our history without acknowledging all of the transgressions, and that is the part that they played in advancing slavery in this country. Yet the president's administration wants to ban books that even mentions slavery. Now, there's a disconnect there for me, Linda, because they want to erase part of American history that deals with the brutality of my ancestors and your ancestors, while at the same time honoring those same leaders that made that brutality possible. I have an issue with that. And, it's important when you think of the fact that our history could be erased. That's mind boggling. And I know many of us probably can't even understand that concept. It doesn't even make sense to even think that way. But as you've already stated, the more we allow to happen, the more that's possible to happen. But banning that part of our American history is crucial moving forward. And those of us today are aware of that history. But what about the future generations of our millennials, our Generation Zs and Alphas? If people aren't aware of what has already happened, there's nothing there to warn them if another similar event is on the rise. And history is extremely important. My question is, how do we keep our history in the books to protect our marginal communities?
Well, one thing that we would do well to remember is all people have transmitted their history throughout the history of the planet. People transmitted their history through oral traditions. That is the first thing that humans did upon learning to speak, is to tell the story of yesterday or yesterdays. We as Black people in America are definitively part of a long history of oral traditions. We have in all African cultures, there is some version of a griot, the person whose responsibility it is to transmit the information of the past. We see the importance of that as Christian people, as Jewish people, because the first books of the Bible are history. It transmits the how we got here story. And even in the time of Jesus, we see the importance of it because his narrative begins with the who begat, who begat, who begat, who begat who. And we are trained in the importance of knowing the backstory and how you got to today. It is no different with people of African descent, with the exception of we are the only people in America whose story was intentionally stripped away upon landing on these shores. We were definitively told, taught, and had it beat into us, or in this case, out of us, any memory of what was. Because if you remembered that, then you might remember unity. You might remember strength in numbers. You might remember your warrior spirit. You might remember the village that you came from. You might remember enough of your past that it would strengthen and support a different future. So if I could make you afraid of that, distrustful of each other, and teach you to never ever speak of it, you will not have any connection with your native name, your native tongue, your native worship, your native ancestry, your history, and all of the power that comes from that. Then that is the first step in absolute authoritative control. And we saw evidence of how that worked to a degree. And I say to a degree because the history persists. It persisted in the braiding of the hair, which told a story. It persisted in the manufacturing of textiles as we had to work them in our enslavement. But we wove the story into those textiles. We manufactured that story into our quilts, our furnishings that we had to make. We made the tools that we had used prior to our enslavement. And so I think that the understanding that when you can strip away a history, then that offers an avenue of control, then we have to operate with the same resistance to that we always have. So it's better in the sense that education has allowed us to be more verbal, more communicative. We can put these ideas in songs, in literature, in movies, in how we tell our story. But it is also an awesome responsibility to not wait for someone else to tell the story. We continue to tell it. Because why do we still have Black History Month? We had to have it because our story was not being told. And when it was told, it often was not told well and not by people who had a vested interest in the story. So the understanding of why it wasn't present in the first place, why the chronology did not follow us along in our words from our hearts, minds, and we did not nurture it in our bosom was because we were systematically taught that there was danger in that. So we have to ask ourselves now, in this moment, while there's still time and opportunity, why are we still acting to some degree as if there's danger in it? We can take control of that part of the narrative and speak that truth to our own power, which is ourselves, our children, our grandchildren. We do it for the ancestors, looking forward to the future generations and all of America, because America can't tell this Swiss cheese manufactured history full of holes, because all of those holes must be clearly occupied by the folks who made history. And it's incomplete without Black history, without Native history, without women's history. All of that is the history. But we, as people of African descent, must not ever betray the past by relinquishing the responsibility for continuing to discover and tell and retell that very important story because we know it's empowering for us as citizens, and for this country.
As I said earlier when I initially introduced you, that you had contributed to some courses at your local high school, not your high school per se, but where you live, providing African American Studies course there. And also you are an accomplished author. You wrote Out from Egypt Land, which also details some things in history from where we've come. And I just want to acknowledge that because you have certainly done the work and put in the time to be able to talk about all of this. And it's extremely important that we just have a better handle as a people of how important our history is and don't disregard it ourselves. Do you want to say anything about the African American Studies course that you developed for your book?
Okay, a little about both. So that class was extremely important. Um, and it was a privilege to be part of the development process. I'd never done anything like that. And a lot of the resource help came from the most unlikely of places, which at that time was the Museum of the Confederacy, which has now been merged with the Museum at the Tredegar Iron Works, so that we have the Museum of Civil War History. And an extremely unlikely resource. I went there. It was one of the first places I went to when I began the research for my book. And you said earlier when we were chatting about how the spirit tells you what to do and you just follow it. And when the spirit told me that, I definitely was in disagreement with the spirit and said, I do not think this is the place where I need to be going to do the type of work that I'm. And the spirit was rather insistent, and I went. And it was just at a moment in time where the museum was beginning to address how it might reimagine itself to tell and present this story of the Confederacy and all of those related artifacts, but in a way that leaned more into the integrity of truth and less leaned away from what I term the moonlight and magnolia mythology of the Confederacy. And they struggled with how do we address this? And it was in that stream that I show up at the Museum of the Confederacy, and I was so welcomed because it was like I was presenting this real life audience in real time. And what do we learn from her? And how do we use what we may learn from her? Even though they knew I was there to see what they had, because I'd heard there was a picture of a Black Confederate in their collection, and I just certainly needed to see this one. And it wound up being a mutually, I don't want to speak for them, but as they shared it with me, it was a mutually amazing experience. Neither the entity of the Museum of the Confederacy nor this Black woman who was doing research expected what we found. So they had a connection with someone who could, as I said, in real time, give them feedback. And in real time, I found an entity, an unlikely entity, leaning forward into the truthful, realistic telling of history. Through that, I not only found a lot of background, didn't really make it into the book, but the headspace that you occupy while you're writing, and especially a fact-based historical fiction is essential to have the things, the tangibles, the visibles. But I also met an amazing young scholar and curator named Cheryl Kingery. She's now at the Cape Fear Museum in North Carolina. But Cheryl Kingery was beginning her work on an exhibit for the museum called Before Freedom Came, which wound up being the most amazing exhibit of the story of enslavement in Virginia through the Civil War era. And it was hard to see and read. And they took over the second floor of what was then the museum. And it was an incredible display that it included things like devices of torture. It included journals left by enslaved people. It included photographs, artifacts. It was moving and hard for me, and a challenge for the museum. That exhibit was reduced to a binder of information, also called Before Freedom Came. And I thought that exhibit and the way it taught that history was so incredible that the local NAACP purchased a copy of that for each school to incorporate into how they presented that history. And whether it was a 5-year-old or an 18-year-old, it was teachable, accessible, and a purchase that I'm still proud of. From that manual of information came basically the syllabus and curricula for teaching African American studies in the high school. And we didn't want, I was definitively against anything that was a reworking of the old way of teaching history. You remember dates and historical figures and places, and then you regurgitate them on a test, and therefore you have learned history. You have not. A teacher helped me to understand very early in my life that understanding when the Declaration of Independence was written was only the beginning. Understanding why it was written and what it said was the important thing. And that was the approach for developing a way to teach history to this class. We had to go back to the origins of man in Africa at the Oduve Gorge and bring us forward to current events. And it was exciting. I was also a guest presenter and teacher of that class. And it was amazing to see our young people explore this information and process this information and excitedly talk about this information as they compared past events to current events. And one of the most unique things that I experienced had nothing to do with being in the class, but it was what led up to the class when we talked to young people at the high school about what they wanted. And I remember one young white male was kind enough and brave enough to say, well, we need this class because you all know this and I don't. Every head swiveled toward him and said, we don't know this either. We're trying to learn. But I honor that young champion because his forward thinking was part of what helped that class become real, because he was one of the student voices who spoke up and spoke to the school board and spoke to the superintendent and said, I need this and my friends need this. And in this moment, where our history is being challenged. We need more people like that young man who thought we all knew something that he didn't know, but he spoke up. He showed up. He stood with his friends that he respected and said, "We need this because I need to understand what's been missing." And apparently, as he grew to know, grew to realize, and they need to understand what has been taken away. But there's always the fear of the persistent fear of too much education can lead to some undesired outcome. And this is a fear that we have to address as Americans, and my fellow white Americans most especially. The persistent fear that history is bad and we need to shy away from it because if you learn of the mistreatment, if you learn of the injustice, then that will endanger white Americans now. I can't think of anything that can be less true because we are not a people of retribution. We are not a people governed by a need for revenge. We are a people thirsting for the knowledge of our past so that we can help make something better of the American future. If we built a past, it should be our pleasure and America's pleasure to help us manage and govern it into our future. If it is understood how well we have done with so little, how far we have come with so many barriers, that shouldn't be frightening, that should be inspiring for whoever hears that story. So if the governing fear is going to continue to be something fomented by the most arrogant and least able, then I say, with all due haste, we must learn these stories, promote these stories, and share how these stories fit into the whole of how we do better together than we can ever do separating ourselves from each other in this storytelling of what America truly aspires to
Well,
be.
first of all, I want to say that it sounds like something that more of us need to gain access to, more school systems actually need to gain access to. Um, Even our own people need to gain access to it because knowledge is power. And like you said, when we're aware of the full history and we have that information, it just gives us what we need in order to, first of all, be appreciative of where we are today to move forward. It gives us exactly what we need to stand on. The other thing I wanted to say to that is that when you talked about the Holy Spirit going into it, wow, it all came together. Look how it all came together. You really got more out of that than what you even anticipated. You were a little, weren't feeling it at first, but once you got there, you see how things just sort of work. I mean, we're moving in our purpose and doing what we're supposed to be doing. So, there's just a lesson there that when we get that gut feeling to make a move, to take some action, that we just need to do it. And I feel that if more of us would do that, even in these dire days, it's just extremely important. When your spirit is telling you, do this, we need to do it. And just see the type of difference and the effect, the impact that we can have overall. And there's one more important thing that I really want us to just mention before we end the podcast, Linda, and that is that I know you've worked across the Commonwealth to improve strategies and policies that will improve the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. What has that process been like? And do you see a dismantling of the great work that has been done in that regard?
Oh, okay. I'm going to say I can see attempts to dismantle it, but uh, truth persists. Uh, 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 Howard University's Hilltop newspaper had the masthead, "Truth crushed to the earth will rise again." So you can attempt to suppress truth, you can try to change truth, you can try to kill truth, you can do whatever you want to truth, but it will persist. So the persistence of the the methodology of good law enforcement, reimagining what community policing looks like. It has been a great privilege to be part of that. It was at the beginning of my executive service for the state NAACP that I was appointed to the state police ad hoc committee. Not only did I not quite know what that meant, but I'm willing to volunteer to do anything that is going to lead to something good. So I didn't quite understand it. I just knew I had been voluntold that that was what my assignment would be. But no one knew where to start. So as I waited for further instruction, the Virginia State Conference NAACP received a phone call from the then superintendent of the Virginia State Police who said, "We need some assistance with our minority recruitment process." And there was the start. And I met with a group of recruiters from the Virginia State Police, and I think it was like right at the end of 1999. And um, we had a very nice conversation that wasn't going anywhere. We were all so polite and measured and thoughtful until one of the recruiters said something about their recruitment poster. Said, "Great, do you happen to have that?" And it was a little flyer version. Yes, proudly, he had printed it out. And I looked at this poster, and there were three white males on this recruitment poster. And I said, "Who do you expect to respond to this?" No one really understood what I was getting at until I used one of my other famous expressions. When you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you always got. So if your goal is to have more females, more people of color, a diverse minority group, that looks like the Commonwealth that you will be serving. If that is your objective, you cannot possibly think you will get it by saying, "But for recruitment purposes, we want three white males." It was the relaxing of all of us and our guarded situation to lean into a conversation of what do we want it to be instead of trying to reconfigure what is the actual objective. Well, it led to some really fruitful conversations that were difficult to have because one of the initial conversations, once we cleared that, what is it actually that you want to do? Then we had to address what was. Because the image of the state police, as far as people of color were concerned, was not good. The history of policing in the United States is predicated on slave patrols, also not good. But if you're unwilling to address the history, you're probably going to keep replicating some of the old mistakes. So it has been an amazing experience for me to learn how law enforcement has been handled, how it has been handled at the state level by the state police. And that's all of the good and all of the not good that led to that post George Floyd reckoning of how do we do this in a way that keeps communities safe or safer, and how do we have law enforcement responding differently? I got the benefit of so much information and insight. Some that was extremely challenging to deal with, some that was amazing by the most amazing people. And there is a state trooper well, he's actually a lieutenant at this point, who was one of those folks that definitively leaned into how to be a better public servant. And having so many people react to what I was attempting to do and attempting to learn, and having such positive help, and having folks so willing to say, I don't know, I didn't have to think about that, but let's talk about it to see if we can get someplace better, has been the most amazing, gratifying, and rewarding part of this job. And the bottom line is we can do better when we talk openly. That is a difficult thing. Talking openly with anything that's going to touch on race, racism, or change, all difficult things, requires honesty. And honesty requires a safe space to be honest in. And I had to learn how to facilitate these discussions in the process. So it changed me greatly. I had to step up my leadership game. I had to step up my desire to learn things that I might not want to know or see or hear. It had me deal with people who did not want to deal with me. And yet, through 3 state police administration changes, and now the 4th, there we see the change, despite who might be in leadership at the presidential level, despite who might be in leadership at the gubernatorial level. We have seen the change. We have experienced the shift. We have seen citizens wanting to be more engaged and have some level of oversight, not management, but let's just be transparent about law enforcement. I saw in the Virginia State Police the willingness to move from the idea, which was abstracted, of serve and protect, to being a guardian in the community, which is important. Because if you see yourself as a guardian, the likelihood diminishes slightly or markedly that you will be an abuser of the community, an enforcer in the community. Just the language change can do so much, but the willingness to learn the culture of policing and why it can become toxic if we're not careful. Watching the behaviors of my sheriff, Scott Mosier, right here in this county, and his ideas of law enforcement and community engagement that leans so much into the positive and the involvement and the support and that guardianship of the community. Just learning these things and being proactively a part of changing ideas of how you recruit, what those outcomes are. And if there was ever a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative that needed to remain intact, despite the governor's orders of its now opportunity, and that opportunity does not come if there's not an awareness of what your goal is. And if your goal is to make it more open, more inclusive, more transparent, then Diversity, equity, inclusion are exactly the right words to use. It is exactly the right goal to have. Because, again, as I said in the beginning, you're going to have to explain to me which one of those three things is what you don't want because it's somehow wrong. It is exactly what all of us would want in any sense of the word. And law enforcement, it is essential to have that mindset so that you know that the person who comes in to help will be helpful because there's an innate understanding of your mutual and conjoined humanity. And law enforcement had become uh, a little chilled toward that goal. But again, being a citizen who had to be taught a lot about law enforcement, and I'm not their defender in any of the toxicity that we have seen in law enforcement, but I am a proponent of when you give folks the right tools, when you address the attitudes, when you drain the toxicity out of the culture, and you make it easier for good cops to not have to ever defend a bad cop, everything shifts to the better because the community sees that and leans into it as the help, not the enemy. And so it has been amazing, an amazing part of my civil rights advocacy, my volunteerism, all of my natural bent to want to make life better for everyone. Being part of that law enforcement conversation has been wonderful because of what I have learned and what I respect about the best of the ladies and gentlemen who get up every morning and put on that uniform and pin on that badge to protect the interest and the laws that protect the citizens.
Mhm. It's interesting that you came back to the diversity, equity, inclusion. There's no better example of diversity, equity, inclusion in play because, the outcome that you got from that is because of the diversity, equity, inclusion. So I think that, again, that just tells the story. It's a great example of why it's so important, why we need it. Wouldn't it be great if even right now, today, with everything that's going on at the national level, that just a group of people, some heads, and I know we've got Congress that's got both sides, we've got people from both sides, but if both sides really came to the table with a mission to really fully understand one another, to fully understand why I feel the way I feel, for both, all sides. That's the only way, as you said earlier, that we can come up with some solutions to help make things better for everyone. But that's being inclusive. We have to include everyone at the table. And it's important to consider everyone. If we're not considering everyone, then that means we're missing something important. We're leaving somebody out. We're probably not doing them any justice because they don't have a say. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is so important, even in planning and developing, just being at the table. So when we do away with it, mm, so I want to thank you for all of your hard work and for everything that you've done through your purpose journey. Now, one last question, and I'm a woman of faith, and I know that you're a woman of faith. I'm also a Christian education leader at my church, and so I'm always telling people, just continue to pray. God is in control. He has the final say, no matter what, because people have really been concerned. I also understand as long as we're working along with God's will, that everything is going to come out the way it should as well. So it's when we're not working within God's will that things just sort of take a left for us. If God's trying to tell us something, that there's some things we need to be doing or should be doing in this particular season. I want to make sure I'm listening. I want to make sure I'm paying attention and that I can hear him. And then not only that, but I want to make sure that I'm in a position to move and to do what I need to do. So this is not the time to be sleeping. We want to continue to pray and we want to continue to believe in what we know is going to happen. But at the same time, what part do we play in that? So that's my question there. What are some practical things that we could be doing?
To remember that the admonition is faith without works. And often we get caught in that place. We're faithful and we believe, we're not doing anything. So there's a short list of things to do. Read to your children, read to your grandchildren, and read things that help them to see all of them in a positive way, help them to understand the history of our people, the history of America. Help them understand how things work. Help them to understand the co-equal branches of government. Help them to understand that all politics is local. Take them to a school board meeting. Take them to a board of supervisors meeting. Help them to understand the value of being an American citizen and why sometimes that requires a fight, a struggle. Help them to understand that mom and dad and grandma and granddad are willing to go to the wall for what is right and fair and just. And be a spokesperson, be an advocate. We keep talking about, well, where are the leaders? Looking at you in the mirror is where the leaders are, because you get to lead your family. You get to lead prayer service at church. You get to lead as the solo singer on the choir. All of these become ways that you connect with people. And as you take off your choir robe, you can ask, are you registered to vote? When you take your child to the library, you can teach them the story of the past greatness, the past crises, the past struggle, because no one seems less willing to tell their story than Black Americans. Because again, the predicates of our existence here was forget your story. Don't remember your story. It's not safe to read. It's not safe to be intellectual. It's not safe to stand out in a crowd. So, what we can do is all that we can to retool, reevaluate, be part of the public conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with my fellow citizens who are not people of color, fellow white citizens, so many times and more times than I wish I did not have to recount. They have said, I never knew that. No one ever told me that. I never heard that before. And I heard so much of that in the process of considering, did Confederate statues belong in public spaces supported by public funds? And the first conversation I'd ever had about that, which was long before the George Floyd or post George Floyd moment, I heard from so many white people that, well, nobody ever said it was a problem before. And I realized that many of them were speaking truthfully, not hopefully, but truthfully saying, no Black person ever said that. A couple of things would make that meaningful and true. One is we don't tend to talk to each other about things that are important. There's a great discomfort with that. There's seldom a real opportunity for that. And when we do have the opportunity, we are usually governed by fear that something bad will happen. Because we also have to understand historically, Black folks prior to the end of the civil rights movement from 1955 to about 1975, there was rightly fear on the behalf of Black Americans. You could lose your job, be burned out, lose your life, lose your children's life. Yeah, all of those things were on the table. For white Americans, depending on who their friendships and associations were, it could be the same for them. And at the very least, they would be marginalized or ostracized in their own communities, places of worship, places of recreation, all of that. So now here we are, still suffering from those old fears, still unwilling to cross those chasms, those barriers that keep us from communicating. So what is essential for all of us and incumbent upon Black folks is to understand the responsibility that is ours at this moment to speak those truths, to understand that we have to have these hard conversations, to create safe spaces to have them. And everybody has to understand that when we do have these conversations, we're all products of our past, all products of the histories that we have been told and are aware of. And there's a lot of emotion and sensitivity that will be tapped into. I can guarantee you. Someone will feel that they are being blamed. Someone will feel a sense of guilt. Someone will feel a sense of anger, and some may even feel a sense of rage. I have facilitated many of these discussions, and I said earlier, I have often in this work been compelled to talk to people who definitively did not wish to speak to me. At the end of those conversations, what I have found is we always leave better than when we began. There's always that intense first 15 or 20 minutes where all of it bubbles to the surface, the resistance to hearing anything that I don't want to hear, the rage that says, I need you to hear this. And once we get past that 20 minutes, and this is where I will take that rare bow because I've never lost control of a meeting. Folks don't leave their seats. We don't move the furniture. But we leave with the understanding of I've now been able to express it. Whatever it is, I express it. And nothing bad happened. And once I realize nothing bad is happening, even if I'm provably wrong in whatever my point of view is, what I find is after the first 20 minutes, folks stop leaning back away from the table and begin to lean into it. If you create a safe space, folks will have a conversation. It does not mean that you will not roll your eyes at times when folks say something that is so outrageous, you cannot believe they gave it oxygen. But once it's said, it's not nearly as frightening or as intense or as um, meaningful or meaningless than it was unsaid. So the best thing that we can do is the thing that Jesus told us to do. Recognize that everybody's your neighbor. Everybody is your neighbor. Your actions will affect your neighbor. So talk to your neighbor, especially when your neighbor doesn't look like you. Value your neighbor because there's something that your neighbor can do that you can't. Understand that your life may depend on your neighbor, that your neighbor may be the first responder, the neighbor may be the protector with the badge on, the neighbor may be your child's Head Start, pre-K, or kindergarten teacher, the first person that influences your child. Those are your neighbors, and we are your neighbors. And the non-melanated folks are our neighbors, and we're Americans here in this space, and we need to be responsible for this country and each other. remembering that we do it, especially those of us, and it seems like there's still this working majority that says we're Christian. Well, then it is incumbent upon us to recognize that Christ was a refugee and an immigrant and a social justice warrior, if ever there was one. So all that we speak of should lead us back to that red letter edition of the Bible, and we read it and reread it until we get it right. And that is what I am trying to do, to make it right and better, and to put my energy and my intellect and my heart and my spirit into being that change. So I'm not going to be afraid in this moment. We've seen this moment before. I'm not going to give up in this moment because my ancestors persisted. So I owe it to them. I owe it to this country. I owe it to my citizenship. I owe it to my God to say, at this moment, I will work even harder for unity. I will work even harder for peace. I will persist in the belief of the rightness of government, the rightness of an elected representative voice, the rightness of participating, the rightness of showing up. But all of that means I got a little less time to watch TV and read nice books and take long walks because the work is real, the work is hard. But I believe that if ever there was a time for the rightness to come shining through, it's now. So it looks dark, it looks bleak, but if it wasn't, we wouldn't recognize the blessing of the sunshine. And so I'm working for more sunshine, and I'm going to work real hard, and I'm going to be real annoying until we get to those sunshiny days.
Social justice. I think when we think in that regard, it all comes back to that. And when we go back to our faith, our belief system, that's what Jesus worked so hard on. That is what he was focused on. And what that says, as you've already said, we each have a responsibility. And if we can talk to people who don't look like us, right? Our neighbors, they are our neighbors. Everyone is our neighbor. And so we need to talk, we need to open up our mouths, we need to share our stories. This is all awesome. Thank you so much, Linda, for sharing some practical ways that we can take some responsibility and play a part in moving forward.
I have one more thing. There's so much said about this moment as it relates to the current president.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to allow that to remove our personal responsibility from the moment. We can talk about people, or we can talk about responsibility, our personal responsibility. And it's so easy to shift all of the blame, all of the responsibility to the current occupant of the White House. I think that is a great mistake. There is much to be said about the power of humans who get themselves on the same page. The same as there's much to be said about the atrocities that humans will cause or allow when they allow themselves to be disconnected from their fellow human beings. If we first recognize the humanity in all people, it will probably be easier for us to converse. And one really quick story that made me examine me was an incident that happened at a gas pump. And my husband and I were in two different vehicles. One was coming out of the repair shop, and I went to pick him up. And there we were at the gas station getting gas for one of the vehicles. And in front of me, I could, he was getting gas at the pump. On the other side of the pump from him was a young man who I can only describe as the consummate version of a skinhead or, you know, that type of really, really far, far, far to the right kind of guy. And I looked at him and I'm thinking, ah, this doesn't look good. And what might happen when he looks over and sees my husband at the other pump is that, all of these thoughts are running through my head. And I'm facing them, and there's no way for me to roll down the window and say anything that's not going to be blatantly obvious. But I just kind of wanted to give the tip off of, hey, situational awareness, because who knows what might happen. As we're all, the gas has been purchased, both parties are ready to leave the pump. And I'm ready to pull out because I want to pull out ahead of this guy and allow my husband to get out as well. As I start out, this guy looks up. He's also starting out and he sees me and I see him. And the brightest, sunniest smile crosses his much tatted face and neck as he gestures for me to please go ahead. And there was a brightness in his, that was the thing that got me, the genuine brightness of his smile and the politeness of the gesture. Your tongue can lie for you, your body will not. And everything in that gesture was communicating friendliness. In that moment, it just, wow, the power of that moment. And I said out loud, thank you, God. I totally prejudged and misjudged this man, which is exactly the thing I fight against: being prejudged, misjudged, misaligned with the truth of who he is. I couldn't see him. I could only see what I thought was him, the physical appearances, those manifestations, or whatever made him tat up, made me think that I knew him. I didn't. I had not even given him half of a chance. I had written his whole backstory and had written a story of what he was about to do. And in one instant, all of that foolishness got swept away. The good thing for me was, as foolish as I wasn't so foolish that I could not see the hand of God in that. It was like, sis, you more than anybody needed to have a lesson in what you thought that looked like, as opposed to being able to assess how you move forward in the mission of a better sense of humanity. And you can't do that if you're going to be running around deciding who's good folks and not folks based on what they look like. That was very important. And that's an important lesson, I think, for all of us as we try to be helpful on this journey, that it isn't so much of who's in leadership or who we've elected. It is our view that we need to one-on-one in every encounter that we have do better as humans who follow the mission. Because if I'm all caught up in the struggle or my blackness or my black history, then I really am less able to communicate those things in a positive way to folks who don't look like me, nor can I intellectually offer any difference to what they already may be thinking. And that's the power of the Holy Spirit. That's the grace of being given a working brain. That is the amazingness that comes from reading and processing and talking to each other to develop a greater understanding. And that is going to be necessary no matter who's in the White House. no matter who's in the governor's mansion, no matter who sits on the school board, because it's always going to come down to what is our ability to both speak the truth and hear somebody else's story. And we cannot continue to be afraid of what might happen if we actually risk saying good morning to our neighbor who does not look like us. Not only do we have to say good morning, but we're going to have to invite that person to have a cup of coffee and tell us about them and then share with them about us. That's the only way it's going to work. That's why Jesus told us about the Good Samaritan. That's why Jesus sat in the temple and spoke. That is why Jesus challenged folks. And that is why Jesus was crucified. We have to remember all of that before we pick up the sign and take to the streets and speak and protest and rally, because that is really the basis of the mission. Isn't it just to love each other? Well, gonna be kind of hard to do that if we ain't talking to each other or deciding who's a neo-Nazi just because I saw you at the gas pump looking wrong.
Wow. Wow. I'm so glad I asked you about some practical strategies because it's not all about just protesting. Wow, Linda, that's a great place to just end it right there. So I want to thank you for your time today. It has been very informative, enlightening, so educational. Just listening to you, and I feel so much better about things because you provided some practical strategies for me too. When we know better, we have to do better. So I just want you to know I appreciate that. And if someone wanted to contact you to be a speaker at their event, to facilitate or to do any of the millions of things that you do every single day, how can they contact you?
It's easy. I'm easy to find. I have a Facebook presence that is public facing. You can also reach me at my email address, lt1863 at AOL.com. Yes, AOL is still a thing. Yes, I still use it. And yes, they have the best firewalls. That's why I still use. So yeah, that is probably the best way. And I welcome um, I welcome anyone reaching out to me, because I look forward to the conversations that need to happen. I look forward to continuing to be a facilitator, an advocate, and helping my community. And my community is everybody. They're my neighbors, and I got to live with my neighbors. And my neighbors are going to have to live with me. So I want to be a better neighbor. And I appreciate so much being part of your podcast.
You're so welcome. And I thank you again today, Linda. I'm so appreciative to have you in our community. Thank you.
You have just listened to Streaming with a Purpose with your host, Sylvia Montgomery. Thank you so much for listening and continue to stay tuned for our next episode. Until then, bye bye.